The private balcony extended over a vast canyon that cut through the heart of the draconian capital, its depths glittering with the lights of countless buildings carved into the ancient stone. Calthrax stood at the railing, his wings drooping at his sides. His tail curled around his feet like a child seeking comfort and a moment of fear. Colonel Beak walked slowly to the railing and stood beside him, looking out at the magnificent city that stretched to the horizon in every direction. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the reception faded behind them, replaced by the gentle whisper of wind through the canyon and the distant hum of spacecraft moving through the night sky. "Why did you stop her?" Calthrax finally asked, his voice small and broken, so different from the arrogant prince who had strutted into the hall just an hour before. "You had every right to watch me grovel. You had every right to enjoy my humiliation after what I said to you." Beak did not answer immediately. He simply continued to look out at the city, his weathered face illuminated by the soft glow of a million lights. "When I was 23 years old," he said eventually, "I served under a commander named Park Junhee, the finest officer I have ever known." Calthrax turned to look at the old human, confused by this apparent change of subject. "I did not respect him at first," Beak continued. "He was quiet and unassuming, not at all like the warriors I had imagined when I was young and dreaming of glory." He smiled slightly at the memory. "I made comments about him to my fellow soldiers. I mocked his cautious approach to combat. I called him a coward behind his back." The young dragon's scales flushed with recognition. "You were like me," he said quietly. "I was exactly like you," Beak agreed. "Young and proud, and absolutely certain that I understood things better than everyone around me." He turned to face Calthrax, his eyes holding no judgment, only understanding. "And then Telos 7 happened. And Commander Park was one of the 33 who died so that I could live." Calthrax felt something cold settle in his chest. "He threw himself between me and a Kethrani blade on the 4th day," Beak said. "A blade that would have killed me instantly if it had found its mark. A blade that he caught with his own body because he knew that someone had to survive to lead the remaining soldiers." The old soldier's voice did not waver, but there was a weight to his words that made them almost unbearable to hear. "I never got to apologize to him," Beak continued. "I never got to tell him that I was wrong, that I had judged him without understanding, that his quiet courage was worth more than all the bravado I had ever possessed." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew something small, a piece of cloth that had been carefully preserved despite decades of wear. It was a military patch, showing the insignia of the United Earth Forces surrounded by a ring of stars. "This belonged to our unit," Beak said, holding the patch up so that Calthrax could see it clearly. "There were 37 of these at the start of the siege, and now there are only 4 left in the entire galaxy." Calthrax stared at the small piece of fabric, understanding beginning to dawn in his golden eyes. The soldiers who wore these patches would have given their lives for anyone in need. Beak said, "It did not matter who you were or where you came from or what species you belonged to. If you needed help, they would have been there." He pressed the patch into Calthrax's clawed hand. "They would have given their lives for you, young prince, even after everything you said tonight, even knowing that you looked at them and saw nothing but prey animals and mayflies." Calthrax's eyes widened with shock. "I cannot accept this," he stammered, trying to push the patch back into Beak's hands. "This is sacred to your people. This represents sacrifices that I have done nothing to deserve. That is exactly why you must accept it," Beak replied gently. "Because true courage is not about earning things. It is about becoming worthy of what has been given to you." The young dragon looked down at the patch, his vision blurring with tears that he had never shed before in his entire privileged life. "I have never faced real danger," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I have never lost anyone. I have never been tested in any way that mattered. He looked up at Beak, his earlier arrogance completely gone, replaced by something raw and vulnerable. How do I become better? How do I become someone worthy of this gift? Beak smiled, and for the first time, there was warmth in his expression. You start by understanding that courage is not about living forever, he said. It is about what you do with the time you have. However long or short that time may be. He placed a gentle hand on the young dragon's arm. Humans live for less than a century. And yet we have produced warriors and artists and dreamers who have changed the course of history, not because we had time to spare, but because we knew that every moment was precious. Calthrax listened with an intensity he had never brought to any lesson in his entire life. Your people have the gift of immortality. Beak continued. But that gift can also be a curse if it teaches you to believe that nothing matters because there will always be more time. He looked out at the glittering city once more. The bravest people I have ever known were those who understood that time is not a resource to be hoarded. It is a gift to be spent in service to others. They stood together in silence for a while longer, two beings from vastly different worlds, connected by something that transcended species and culture and history. When they finally returned to the reception hall, something had changed in Calthrax that everyone could see. He walked differently, stood differently, spoke differently. The arrogant prince who had swaggered into the hall was gone, replaced by a young dragon who was taking his first uncertain steps toward becoming something better. 6 months later, Calthrax volunteered for the newly formed Human Draconian Peacekeeping Corps. Becoming its youngest Draconian recruit, he served alongside human soldiers who welcomed him as a brother, despite everything he had said on the night of his disgrace. And in his personal quarters, mounted in a place of honor above his sleeping chamber, hung a small piece of fabric bearing the insignia of the United Earth Forces, a reminder that courage is not about living forever. It is about what you do with the time you have. The end. The diplomatic hall had transformed into something that felt more like a courtroom, with Calthrax standing at its center like a criminal awaiting judgment. The young prince's purple scales had lost their lustrous sheen, fading to a pale lavender that betrayed his mounting terror all around him. The veterans of the Draconian military continued to hold their salutes toward Colonel Beak, their wings spread wide in the ancient gesture of respect that their culture reserved for only the most exceptional warriors. Calthrax's companions had completely abandoned him now, melting back into the crowd to avoid being associated with his catastrophic mistake. He stood alone, isolated, stripped of every advantage that his birth and status had always provided. A commotion at the eastern entrance drew everyone's attention, and the crowd parted quickly to allow passage to a dragon whose scales shimmered with the same deep purple as the prince's own High Duchess Sirithana, third wife of the emperor and mother to Calthrax, swept into the hall with the terrible grace of a storm approaching landfall. She was ancient by any measure, having lived for nearly 4,000 years, and her golden eyes blazed with a fury that made even the bravest warriors in the room take an involuntary step backward. "What has my son done?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. Lord Varanex finally lowered his salute and turned to face the Duchess, his expression grave. "Your Highness," he said, "Prince Calthrax has insulted a human warrior of exceptional distinction, a soldier whose deeds at the siege of Telos 7 were witnessed and documented by our own military observers." Sirithana's eyes widened, and then narrowed with understanding. She had heard the reports from Telos 7 when they first arrived at the imperial court, and she remembered the disbelief that had swept through the military council when they learned what a handful of humans had accomplished. "He insulted a survivor of the 11 days, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "My son insulted one of the humans who held the mountain pass." "Yes, Your Highness," Varanex confirmed. He called the colonel a withered creature, a mayfly, and a prey animal. Among other things, Sirathana closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, they were fixed on her son with an intensity that made him shrink back despite his considerable size. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" she asked, each word landing like a hammer blow. "Do you understand the disgrace you have brought upon our house?" Calthrax tried to speak, to offer some kind of excuse or explanation, but his voice would not cooperate. All he could do was stand there, trembling, as his mother approached him with slow and deliberate steps. "In all the history of our empire," Sirathana continued, "there has never been a greater shame than to mock a proven warrior, to dismiss the sacrifices of those who have faced death in service to others." She stopped directly in front of her son, close enough that he could feel the heat of her breath against his scales. "And you have done this to a human who achieved what our own analysts declared impossible, to a soldier who has been saluted by Lord Varenax himself." She gestured at the crowd of veterans who still watched the scene with expressions of contempt and disappointment. "You will kneel," Sirathana commanded. "You will kneel before this human warrior and beg his forgiveness for your words. And you will pray that he has more mercy in his heart than you deserve." Calthrax's legs began to bend, his body responding to his mother's authority, even as his mind reeled with humiliation. But before he could complete the gesture, a quiet voice interrupted. "That will not be necessary." Everyone turned to look at Colonel Beak, who had stepped forward from his corner and now stood facing the Duchess with the same calm composure he had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. Sirathana's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You would refuse the apology of a prince of the blood?" she asked. "You would deny my son the chance to make amends for his offense?" "I am not refusing anything," Beak said gently. "I am simply saying that I do not want the boy humiliated." The word boy hung in the air, and Calthrax felt it strike deeper than any of the insults he had thrown earlier. To be called a boy by this small, scarred human, to be reduced to a child in front of the entire court. But there was no mockery in Beak's voice, no satisfaction or cruelty. There was only something that sounded almost like sympathy. "I have been where your son stands now," the colonel continued, addressing Sirathana but speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I was young once, and I was arrogant, and I made mistakes that I am still ashamed of decades later." He glanced at Calthrax, and something in his expression softened. "Forcing him to grovel in public will only breed resentment. It will teach him nothing except that humiliation is the price of defeat." Sirathana studied the human for a long moment, her ancient mind working behind her golden eyes. "Then what would you have me do?" she asked finally. "You have been wronged, and our laws demand satisfaction." Beak considered the question carefully before answering. "Let me speak with him," he said. "Alone, without an audience, without the weight of all these expectations pressing down on both of us." He looked at Calthrax, meeting the young dragon's eyes directly for the first time since the confrontation began. "I think your son has already learned something tonight, but the lesson will not take root if it is planted in shame and watered with tears." The Duchess looked at Lord Varenax, who gave a slow nod of approval. "This is unprecedented," Sirathana said. "No human has ever been given such authority over a member of the imperial family. Then let tonight be the beginning of a new precedent." Beak replied, "Let it be the night when humans and dragons started to see each other as something more than strangers." After a long silence, Sirathana stepped back and gestured toward a side corridor that led to the private balconies overlooking the capital city. "You may have your conversation," she said. "But know this, human, if my son returns unchanged, there will be consequences that even your remarkable deeds cannot shield you from." Beak bowed respectfully. "I understand, Your Highness." He turned and walked toward the corridor, pausing only to look back at Kelthrax, who remained frozen in place, uncertain of what to do. "Are you coming, young prince?" Beak asked. "I believe we have much to discuss." After a moment of hesitation, Kelthrax followed the old human soldier out of the hall, leaving behind a crowd of dragons who watched their departure with expressions of wonder and disbelief. No one knew what would happen next, but everyone understood that something significant had begun, something that would echo through the histories of both species for generations to come. Colonel Beak looked up at the young dragon prince, and for the first time since the confrontation began, something shifted in his eyes. It was not anger, and it was not pride. It was something far older and far heavier, the weight of memories that no amount of time could ever fully erase. "You asked about my scars," Beak said, his voice still quiet, but now carrying a depth that seemed to pull the attention of everyone in the hall. "You want to know what battles a human could possibly fight that would matter to beings like yourselves." He paused and looked around the room, taking in the faces of dragons who had lived for centuries, who had witnessed the rise and fall of entire civilizations, who believed themselves to be the masters of all creation 27 years ago. "I was stationed on a world called Telos 7, he continued. It was a mining colony on the edge of human space, home to about 3,000 civilians who were just trying to build a life for their families in a difficult place. Kelthrax opened his mouth to make another mocking comment, but something in the old soldier's tone made him hesitate. The words would not come, and so he simply stood there, listening despite himself. "The Kethrani attacked without warning," Beak said. 2,000 warriors descended on that colony in the middle of the night, burning everything they touched and killing everyone they found. A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. The Kethrani were known throughout the galaxy as one of the most brutal species in existence. Savage predators who viewed all other forms of life as nothing more than prey to be hunted and consumed. Even the Draconians, with all their power and pride, treated the Kethrani with caution. "There was a mountain pass on the north side of the colony," Beak continued. "The only route to safety for the civilians who managed to escape the initial attack." He looked down at his scarred arm, remembering, "I was part of a unit of 37 soldiers who were ordered to hold that pass until the evacuation shuttles could arrive." Lord Varenax stepped forward from the crowd, his ancient face now showing clear recognition. "I know this battle," he said, his deep voice rumbling through the hall. "The Draconian Empire sent observers to tell us 7 after we detected the Kethrani fleet moving through that sector." He turned to look at the other guests, his expression grave. "We did not intervene because we believed there was no point. We calculated that the humans would be overrun within hours, and that any attempt at rescue would simply result in additional losses." Beak nodded slowly, acknowledging the general's words without any trace of resentment. "Your observers were probably right to think that way," he said. "By all logic, we should have died on the first day." He turned his gaze back to Kelthrax, who had gone very still, his scales seeming to pale slightly under the hall's golden light. "But we did not die on the first day, or the second, or the third." The old soldier's voice remained calm, almost gentle, but there was something in it now that commanded absolute attention. "For 11 days, 37 humans held that pass against 2,000 Kethrani warriors. We fought without sleep, without reinforcements, without any hope that help would arrive in time." He held up his scarred arm. "These marks came from a Kethrani blade on the 7th day, when they broke through our lines for the first time, and I had to fight them off with nothing but a combat knife because my rifle had run out of ammunition." The silence in the hall was absolute. By the end of the siege, only 4 of us were still alive, Beak said. 33 of my friends died in that pass, some of them in my arms, some of them while I was too far away to help. He paused, and when he spoke again, His voice carried a weight of grief that transcended species and culture and language. But the evacuation shuttles arrived on the 12th day. And because of what we did, 2,700 civilians lived to see another sunrise. Calthrax's companions had fallen completely silent, their earlier amusement replaced by expressions of growing horror as they began to understand what they were hearing. "You asked what battles a mayfly could fight that would matter," Beak said, looking directly into the young prince's golden eyes. "I do not know if that battle mattered to anyone else in the galaxy, but it mattered to the children who grew up because we gave them the chance. Lord." The Renac stepped forward and performed a gesture that made every dragon in the hall gasp. He crossed his arms over his chest, lowered his great head, and extended his wings in the draconian warrior's salute of highest honor. A gesture that had never before been given to any being who was not of dragon blood. The observers reported what they saw at Telos 7. The Renac said, his voice filled with something that sounded almost like reverence. "They told us that it was impossible, that no species could do what those humans did, that the mathematics of combat simply did not allow for such an outcome." He raised his head and looked at Beak with eyes that had witnessed millennia of warfare. "We studied that battle for years, trying to understand how it could have happened, and we never found an answer that satisfied our analysts. One by one, other draconian veterans in the hall began to perform the same salute, their wings spreading and their heads bowing in recognition of a warrior whose deeds transcended the boundaries of species. Calthrax stood frozen in place, his earlier arrogance crumbling around him like a structure built on sand. He looked at the old human before him, really looked for the first time, and what he saw made his stomach turn with shame. This was not a withered creature to be mocked and dismissed. This was a warrior who had faced horrors that Calthrax could not even imagine, who had sacrificed everything for the sake of strangers, who had earned the respect of dragons through deeds rather than through birth or title. The young prince's friends began to step away from him, putting distance between themselves and his disgrace. In draconian culture, there was no greater shame than insulting a proven warrior. And Calthrax had just done exactly that in front of the entire diplomatic corps. His earlier words echoed in his memory like poison withered creature. Mayfly, prey animal. He had said those things to a hero, a legend, a soldier whose courage had been witnessed and documented by draconian observers themselves. And now every dragon in the hall knew exactly what kind of fool their prince had proven himself to be. The grand diplomatic hall of the Draconian Empire stretched for nearly half a kilometer in every direction, its obsidian walls carved with the histories of 10,000 generations of dragon rulers who had conquered and commanded the stars, long before humanity had learned to make fire. Ambassador Yoon Ji-hye walked through the massive entrance with her small delegation, her eyes taking in the overwhelming display of ancient power that surrounded them on every side. Crystal chandeliers, the size of human spacecraft, hung from ceilings so high they disappeared into shadow. And everywhere she looked, there were dragons of every color and size, their scales glittering like precious gems under the soft golden light. This was humanity's first formal reception on Syraxis, the throne world of an empire that had existed for over 50,000 years. And Ji-hye felt the weight of that history pressing down on her shoulders with every step she took. Walking 3 paces behind her was Colonel Beak Sung-ho, retired from active service, but still carrying himself with the quiet discipline of a man who had spent 40 years defending humanity across a dozen different star systems. He was 63 years old now, his hair gray and his face weathered by time and hardship. But his eyes remained sharp and watchful as they moved across the crowded hall. The Draconians towered over the human visitors, most of them standing at least 3 meters tall, their powerful wings folded against their backs and their long tails curling around their feet as they watched the Newcomers with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed contempt. Jihei had prepared for this moment for 3 years, studying draconian culture and language and history until she could recite the names of every emperor who had ever sat upon the obsidian throne. She knew that the dragons viewed themselves as the rightful rulers of the galaxy, the first species to achieve spaceflight and the founders of interstellar civilization itself. To them, humanity was nothing more than a collection of clever animals who had somehow stumbled into the stars without any understanding of their proper place in the cosmic order. But the trade accord that had been signed that morning represented something new, a chance for humanity to prove itself worthy of respect in the eyes of the oldest and proudest civilization in known space. Jihei accepted a crystal goblet of wine from a passing servant and smiled graciously at the draconian diplomats who approached her with carefully worded congratulations behind her. Colonel Beak declined all refreshment and simply stood in a corner where he could observe the entire room without being observed in return. He had been assigned to this mission as a security advisor, but Jihei knew that his real purpose was to serve as a symbol of human strength and resilience. Beak Seung-ho was a legend among human military circles, one of the most decorated soldiers in the history of the United Earth Forces, a man who had faced impossible odds and somehow emerged victorious time and time again. But to the dragons who glanced at him with dismissive eyes, he was simply an old man, small and soft and fragile, a creature whose entire lifespan would barely register as a moment in their immortal memories. The reception continued for several hours, with speeches and toasts and the careful exchange of diplomatic pleasantries that meant everything and nothing. At the same time, Jihei was beginning to think that the evening might pass without incident when she heard a commotion near the western entrance and turned to see a group of young dragons pushing their way through the crowd. At their head was a dragon whose scales shimmered with the deep purple color that marked him as a member of the imperial bloodline, his golden eyes arrogant and his posture radiating the confidence of someone who had never been told no in his entire life. This was Prince Kelthrax, 19th in line for the throne and barely past his first molt, which made him roughly equivalent to a 19-year-old. Human in terms of maturity and experience, he was accompanied by a dozen other young nobles, all of them laughing and joking as they surveyed the reception with obvious boredom. Kelthrax had never met a human before tonight, and as his gaze swept across the room, it was clear that he found the experience deeply underwhelming. He whispered something to one of his companions, and the entire group burst into hissing laughter that drew disapproving looks from some of the older dragons nearby. Jihei felt a chill run down her spine as she watched Kelthrax's attention fix on something across the hall, and when she followed his gaze, her heart sank. The young prince was staring directly at Colonel Beak, who stood alone in his corner, his hands clasped behind his back and his expression completely neutral. There was something predatory in the way Kelthrax began moving through the crowd, his friends trailing behind him like a pack of hunting animals, following the scent of prey. Jihei tried to intercept them, but the crowd was too thick and she was too far away, and all she could do was watch as the young dragon prince approached. The old human soldier with cruel amusement glittering in his golden eyes, Beak noticed the approaching group but made no move to leave his position or to prepare himself for whatever was coming. Simply stood there, calm and patient, like a man who had seen too much in his life to be frightened by the posturing of children. No matter how large or powerful those children might be, Kelthrax stopped directly in front of the human veteran, towering over him by more than 2 meters, his wings spreading slightly to make himself appear even larger and more intimidating. The conversations around them began to fade as other guests noticed what was happening and turned to watched some of the older draconian diplomats, exchanged worried glances, but none of them moved to intervene. This was a member of the imperial family, and no one would dare to challenge him in public. Regardless of what he might do or say, Calthrax looked down at the small human before him, his lips curling back to reveal rows of teeth that could tear through steel, and when he spoke, his voice was loud enough to carry across the entire hall. The young prince wanted an audience for whatever performance he was about to give. And now he had one. Every eye in the room was fixed on the confrontation unfolding in that corner. And Jihei could only hold her breath and pray that Colonel Beak would find some way to defuse the situation before it spiraled completely out of control. But looking at the cold amusement in the Dragon Prince's eyes, she suspected that prayer alone would not be enough to save them from what was about to happen. Prince Calthrax let the silence stretch for several long seconds, savoring the attention of the crowd like a performer preparing for his greatest scene. When he finally spoke, his voice dripped with the kind of casual cruelty that only comes from someone who has never faced consequences for their actions. So this is what humans sent to represent their species at a gathering of civilized beings, Calthrax said, his words carrying clearly through the silent hall. I must admit I expected something more impressive than a withered little creature who looks like he might crumble to dust if I breathed too hard. His friends hissed with laughter behind him, their tails twitching with amusement. Colonel Beak said nothing, his expression remaining as calm and neutral as it had been since the moment he arrived at the reception. He simply looked up at the young dragon with eyes that held neither fear nor anger, only a quiet patience that seemed to irritate Calthrax even more than defiance would have. What is the matter, human? The prince continued, leaning down until his snout was only centimeters from Beak's face. Has age stolen your tongue along with your strength and your dignity? I have nothing to say to you. Young prince, Beak replied in fluent Draconian, his pronunciation perfect despite his accent. I am simply here to observe and to serve my ambassador. Calthrax's eyes widened slightly at hearing his own language spoken by this small creature, but he recovered quickly and let out a bark of contemptuous laughter. It speaks our tongue, he announced to his companions. The prey animal has learned a few tricks. How delightful. He straightened up and began to circle around Beak like a predator examining a potential meal, his tail sweeping across the polished floor with each step. Tell me, little human, do your people always send their elderly to important diplomatic functions? Or is this some kind of insult that we are too civilized to understand? Ambassador Yoon finally managed to push through the crowd, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Your Highness, she said, keeping her voice carefully controlled. Colonel Beak is a highly respected member of our delegation and a hero of the United Earth Forces. I would ask that you treat him with the courtesy befitting this occasion. Calthrax turned his golden gaze on her, and for a moment she thought he might redirect his cruelty in her direction. But then he simply waved one clawed hand dismissively, as if brushing away an annoying insect. I was not speaking to you, female, he said. Go back to your wine and let me examine this curiosity in peace. Jihai's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she knew that causing a scene would only make things worse for everyone. She caught Beak's eye, silently asking if he wanted her to intervene further. But the old soldier gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. Whatever was happening here, he intended to handle it himself. Calthrax continued his examination, reaching out with one claw to prod at Beak's shoulder like someone poking a strange animal to see if it was still alive. Your species fascinates me, the prince said, his tone now taking on the quality of a lecturer addressing a particularly slow student. You live for what, 70 or 80 years if you are lucky, and yet you strut around the galaxy as if you actually matter. He paused and looked at his friends. making sure they were appreciating his performance. You are mayflies playing at civilization. Insects who happened to discover spaceflight before you could go extinct. And yet, you come to our world and expect to be treated as equals. The older draconian diplomats in the crowd were beginning to look genuinely uncomfortable. Now, several of them had dealt with humans before and knew that the species was far more dangerous than their appearance suggested, but none of them spoke up, because challenging a member of the imperial family in public was simply not done, regardless of how badly that family member was behaving. I have a question for you, old human, Kelthrax said, stopping directly in front of Beak once more. What battles has your species ever fought that would entitle you to stand in the presence of dragon royalty? He gestured at Beak's chest, where a row of military ribbons was pinned to his formal jacket. What are these colorful little decorations supposed to represent? Victories over vermin on your own world. Skirmishes with other prey animals who are even weaker than you. His voice rose with theatrical contempt. My ancestors were conquering star systems when your ancestors were still living in caves and painting pictures on walls. Your entire civilization is nothing more than a momentary flicker in the eternal flame of draconian glory. Beak remained silent through all of this, his hands still clasped behind his back, his breathing slow and steady. Something in his stillness seemed to unsettle Kelthrax, who had clearly expected more of a reaction to his insults. Perhaps humans hire real warriors to fight their battles, the prince suggested, looking around at his friends with a smirk. Perhaps this old creature is simply here for decoration. A pet brought along to make the humans feel less pathetic. One of his companions, a green-scaled noble named Theraxis, leaned forward eagerly. Ask him about the scars, Kelthrax. I want to hear what kind of injuries a mayfly can possibly consider worthy of remembrance. The prince's eyes lit up at this suggestion, and he reached out to grab Beak's left arm, pushing up the sleeve of his jacket to reveal a network of old scars that covered the veteran's skin from wrist to elbow. What is this? Kelthrax demanded, his claws pressing against the raised tissue. Did you fall into a thorn bush on your home world? Did some small creature bite you while you were sleeping? The hall had gone completely silent now. Even the servants had stopped moving, frozen in place as they watched the confrontation unfold. Lord Viranax, a senior draconian general who had lived for over 3,000 years and had seen more battles than most species could imagine, stood near the front of the crowd with an expression that had shifted from disapproval to something that looked almost like alarm. He recognized those scars. Or rather, he recognized the pattern they formed. He had seen similar marks on warriors who had survived certain kinds of combat, specific types of engagements that were so brutal they left permanent memories on the bodies of everyone who lived through them. Answer me. Human, Kelthrax demanded, his patience finally starting to wear thin. Tell everyone here about your great battles. Share with us the magnificent history of your warrior species. Colonel Beak finally spoke, his voice quiet but somehow carrying across the entire hall with perfect clarity. Are you certain you want to know? Young prince, there was no threat in his words, no anger or resentment. There was only a question, delivered with the calm certainty of a man who had long since learned that some truths were heavier than others. Kelthrax hesitated for just a moment, something in the human's tone sending a flicker of uncertainty across his features, but then his pride reasserted itself, and he released Beak's arm with a contemptuous snort. Yes, little human, enlighten us all with your tales of glory. The old soldier nodded slowly, and when he spoke again, his words would change everything.